At shortly after 10 o'clock in the morning on July 26, 1944, the heavy cruiser USS Baltimore eased into her berth at the Pearl Harbor Naval Station beneath a sky gone white with heat, and the man who descended the gangway onto the concrete of the dock was not a sailor. Franklin Roosevelt was 62 years old, visibly thin, supported by aides as he moved toward the waiting cars. He had come from San Diego across 4 days of open Pacific, in a journey his physicians had reluctantly approved. The 1944 election was 4 months away, and the Pacific War had reached the phase where its final direction had to be set. The route to Japan, the strategy for the last campaign, and beneath both of those, the question that had been building in memoranda and meetings across Washington and Brisbane and Pearl Harbor for 2 years. The question of who was in command. Waiting on the dock was the Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet. Chester Nimitz had arranged the quarters, prepared the briefings, and coordinated the logistics of the presidential visit with the efficiency that characterized every operation his headquarters ran. He was 60 years old, compact, unhurried, wearing the 4 stars of a full admiral on the collar of his summer whites. He had held command of the Pacific Fleet since Christmas morning of 1941, through Midway, Guadalcanal, the Central Pacific Drive, and the taking of the Marianas. He had overseen the destruction of the Japanese carrier fleet, rebuilt American naval power from the wreckage of December 7th, and assembled at Pearl Harbor the most powerful armada in the history of the world. He was also, in the summer of 1944, about to fight the hardest battle of his career. Not at sea, in a conference room. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what was actually at stake in the 3 days that followed Roosevelt's arrival in Hawaii, you have to go back to the spring of 1942, when the Pacific Command structure was first assembled in the chaos and reorganization that followed Pearl Harbor. The arrangement that emerged was a compromise of the kind military professionals recognize immediately as the seed of a future crisis. General Douglas MacArthur commanded the Southwest Pacific area, Australia, New Guinea, the Philippines, and the surrounding waters. Admiral Nimitz commanded the Pacific Ocean areas, the Central Pacific, the North Pacific, the South Pacific, and critically the Pacific Fleet itself, which had no fixed geographic boundary, because fleets move and their purpose is movement. The two commands had different strategic priorities, different service cultures, and two commanders whose temperaments were as different as the branches they represented. MacArthur had been a figure in American public life since 1932. He designed his own uniform, the crushed cap, the sunglasses, the corncob pipe, and understood, with the instinct of a man who had been performing for audiences since West Point, that image and reality are not separable questions in a democracy at war. His headquarters generated communiques with the regularity of a wire service, and those communiques consistently attributed to his personal direction victories won by units he had barely spoken to. He had been awarded the Medal of Honor upon arriving in Australia in March of 1942, a decoration whose circumstances historians have questioned ever since. Issued under conditions involving a retreat from the Philippines that MacArthur framed as a strategic withdrawal, and that his critics framed differently. He was brilliant, difficult, politically sophisticated in ways that went beyond mere calculation, and constitutionally incapable of accepting the idea that any military force within his reach should answer to someone other than himself. Nimitz was the opposite in nearly every observable way. His headquarters at Makalapa Hill above the Pearl Harbor submarine base ran on a schedule so regular that officers reported being able to set their watches by his morning walks. He played horseshoes in the late afternoon. He kept a small dachshund. He had been selected for SINCPAC not because he was the most senior admiral available, but because Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, believed the Pacific Fleet needed after Pearl Harbor's shock not a performer, but a technician, a man who could absorb catastrophe, assess what remained, and methodically rebuild it. King's assessment proved correct, and for 2.5 years Nimitz had delivered exactly what King had foreseen. King himself requires attention because he is the institutional spine of this account. He served simultaneously as Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet and Chief of Naval Operations, a concentration of naval authority with no precedent in American history. He was cold, demanding, politically precise, and in the recollection of those who served closely with him, capable of a severity that went beyond ordinary professional harshness. On the question of whether the Pacific Fleet should remain under naval command, he was not diplomatic. He was categorical. His documented position was that naval operations, fleet maneuvering, carrier aviation, amphibious logistics, submarine warfare, the intricate choreography of a fast carrier task force operating thousands of miles from its nearest fixed base, require a depth of professional understanding that cannot be improvised by officers trained in land warfare. A general who had never navigated a task force through the Philippine Sea did not become qualified to do so by virtue of seniority or accomplishment on land. Command of naval forces by Army officers was structurally unsound regardless of the individual officer involved. King had written this position into memoranda for the Joint Chiefs. He had argued it in meetings with General Marshall. He had been refused on every occasion, and he had not changed his position by a single word. General Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, was not MacArthur's uncritical advocate. His relationship with MacArthur was complicated by the same institutional loyalty and private reservations that marked most of MacArthur's professional relationships. But his institutional position was clear. If the Pacific was to have a unified command, it should be held by an Army officer, and the senior Army officer in the Pacific was MacArthur. His position papers to the Joint Chiefs in early 1944 argued this with the systematic thoroughness that characterized his staff work. He did not invoke MacArthur's name in every paragraph. He did not need to. The institutional arithmetic was clear to everyone reading the documents. MacArthur had been making his own case directly to Washington for 2 years by the time the Honolulu Conference was scheduled. His communications argued that the divided Pacific Command was wasteful of resources, generative of friction, and strategically incoherent at exactly the moment coherence was most necessary. He was correct about the diagnosis. Unity of command is a sound principle, and the divided arrangement had real costs. What his argument required accepting: that MacArthur himself was the appropriate officer to exercise unified command over forces he had never commanded, was the premise that King and Nimitz refused. The Joint Chiefs reached the impasse that professional military bodies reach when they cannot resolve an institutional dispute at the institutional level, and they carried the question upward to the one authority above both services. Roosevelt's solution was the conference at Pearl Harbor. He would meet with MacArthur and Nimitz, hear their strategic arguments, and make a decision, or appeared while deferring the harder organizational question until the operational picture clarified. The strategic debate was genuine. MacArthur's Southwest Pacific route through the Philippines against the Navy's Central Pacific approach toward Formosa and Japan's home islands. But beneath the strategy question, visible to everyone in the room, was the command question. The decision about which route to take was simultaneously a decision about which officers' theater and institutional framework would dominate the war's final phase. Nimitz received his instructions from King before the conference. He was to present the Navy's strategic position, the Formosa option, professionally and without escalating the command dispute directly. King would manage the command question from Washington. Nimitz's job was to represent the operational case, and to do it in a way that demonstrated, through the quality of his staff work and the steadiness of his professional manner, that the Pacific Fleet was in the right hands. He had reservations about the Formosa option. His staff's assessment was that the logistical requirements exceeded what was available, but at Honolulu he was the Navy's representative and he would present the Navy's position. MacArthur arrived from Brisbane without his senior staff on the morning of July 26th. He was 64 years old, lean, impeccably turned out, and he had been preparing for this meeting with a thoroughness that went beyond operational planning. He understood that what was being decided in Hawaii was not merely the route to Tokyo. It was his place in the record of the war. The conference sessions took place over 3 days in the presidential quarters at the naval station. No verbatim transcript survives. What is documented comes from the post-war recollections of participants and from Nimitz's own assessments preserved in E.B. Potter's authorized biography. MacArthur spoke at length in the first session, moving through his arguments with the fluency of a man who had been constructing this brief for 2 years. He argued that the Philippines occupied the central position in the Japanese defensive arc, that bypassing the islands would leave an intact enemy force astride American supply lines, that the logistical case for Formosa was weaker than the Navy acknowledged, and that the liberation of the Filipino people and the American prisoners held in Japanese captivity represented a moral obligation the United States could not in good conscience abandon. He invoked American honor. He invoked the soldiers who had died at Bataan. He argued all of it well. Roosevelt listened and gave nothing back. Nimitz presented the Navy's alternative in the manner that characterized all of his professional communication, organized, grounded in specific logistical data, supported by his staff's analytical work. Fuel consumption estimates, transit time calculations, force requirement assessments, the operational logic of the Central Pacific Axis. His presentation was orderly, and his staff work was meticulous. He was not MacArthur's equal as a performer, and there is no evidence that it concerned him. His job at the table was not to outshine the general. It was to represent the Navy's analysis accurately. He did that. Roosevelt returned to Washington without having formally resolved either question. He had listened to 2 very different men across 3 days in the Hawaiian heat and had given nothing away. 6 weeks later, at the Quebec Conference in September of 1944, the Joint Chiefs ratified the Philippines route, specifically Leyte Gulf, as the next major Pacific objective. MacArthur had won the strategic argument. The Philippines would be liberated. His promised return would be honored. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The command question resolved itself differently by the absence of a formal decision rather than the presence of one. MacArthur was not given unified command of the Pacific. Nimitz remained SINCPAC. The Pacific Fleet remained under naval command. The principle King had defended was preserved, not because Roosevelt formally rejected MacArthur's proposal in terms MacArthur could appeal, but because Roosevelt, who understood the political dimensions of military appointments with precision that military officers sometimes underestimated, declined to make the appointment MacArthur wanted. The consequences of what had not been properly decided became visible in the waters east of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944. The battle fought there across 4 days, October 23rd through 26th, was the largest naval engagement in recorded history. Halsey commanded 3rd Fleet and reported to Nimitz. Kinkaid commanded 7th Fleet and reported to MacArthur. The 2 fleets were operating in adjacent waters, sharing an operational objective, the defense of the Leyte beachhead, without a single officer accountable for both of them. When Halsey took his fast carriers north to pursue the Japanese carrier decoys, he left the San Bernardino Strait uncovered. Kinkaid, reporting to MacArthur rather than to Halsey, had not been informed of Halsey's departure and believed a covering force remained in place. The Japanese center force under Admiral Takeo Kurita came through the strait before dawn on October 25th and fell upon the escort carriers and thin-hulled destroyers of Taffy 3 off the coast of Samar. What followed belongs to any account of American naval courage in the Pacific. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's ships, small escort carriers designed for anti-submarine patrol, escorted by destroyers built for convoy work rather than fleet action, faced a Japanese surface force that included Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, along with heavy cruisers and fleet destroyers whose combined gun power should have ended the action in 30 minutes. The destroyers made torpedo runs against capital ships, accepting near-certain destruction to buy time. Aircraft launched from the escort carriers made repeated passes with whatever ordnance was available. The smoke of battle, the confusion inherent in large naval engagements, and the cautious temperament of Kurita himself combined to produce a Japanese withdrawal that no American plan had counted on. The battle had been a victory. It had not been a victory because the command structure worked. The gap through which Kurita's fleet had passed was the direct product of the arrangement the Honolulu Conference had failed to resolve. 2 admirals answering to different chains of command, operating without unified authority over a shared objective, had allowed a fault line to open in the American position. Nimitz's message to Halsey during the battle, "Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders," is remembered for the accidental taunt that the padding carried, for Halsey's tears on the flag bridge when he read it, for the human weight of a man who understood in that moment the size of his error. What is less often examined is the institutional content of the message itself. The commander of the Pacific Fleet did not know where a major element of his own force had gone. The command structure had failed before the first Japanese shell was fired. Nimitz did not use the near catastrophe to relitigate the command dispute. He did not go to King with an argument that Leyte Gulf had proved his case. He absorbed the lessons, adjusted his communications protocols, and continued fighting the war. His after-action focus was on what could be done differently rather than on establishing blame for what had gone wrong. This was consistent with everything known about how he managed his command, and it was, in its way, a continuation of the same institutional philosophy that had guided his behavior throughout the command dispute. He served the institution. He left the politics to King. The Okinawa campaign, from April through June of 1945, was fought under his command as the costliest American operation of the Pacific War. The kamikaze struck in coordinated waves that damaged hundreds of Allied ships. The ground campaign consumed Marine and Army divisions at rates the casualty figures struggle to convey. The daily lists reached his desk at Makalapa Hill. His staff described him during Okinawa as unchanged in his habits: morning walk, morning briefings, afternoon planning, evening review. The steadiness was not indifference. It was the professional discipline of a man who understood that visible anguish communicates to an organization that its leader has run out of answers, and that his answers were still required. Planning for the invasion of Japan produced the final command arrangement. MacArthur was designated overall commander for the ground campaign. Nimitz would command the naval forces. The arrangement preserved the dual command at a higher level, the two men in parallel rather than one subordinate to the other. King, who had fought the command battle in Washington through 3 years of the Pacific War, had preserved the fundamental principle. The Pacific Fleet would not serve under an Army general. It would serve under a naval officer, commanded and directed by men who had spent their professional lives learning the specific art that naval command required. The invasion never happened. The atomic bombs at Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, followed by the Soviet declaration of war against Japan, brought Japan to surrender before the first landing craft headed for the home islands. On September 2nd, 1945, on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the instruments of Japan's formal surrender were signed. MacArthur presided as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. He was dressed impeccably. He spoke briefly and well. Nimitz signed for the United States. MacArthur's name appeared first on the documents. The Navy was present, intact under its own command. The question the title of this account poses, what Nimitz did when Washington tried to hand his Pacific Fleet to MacArthur, has an answer that is harder to narrate than a confrontation would have been, and more consequential than a confrontation could have produced. What Nimitz did was almost nothing visible. He filed his position papers through King. He presented the Navy's case at Honolulu with professional precision. He maintained through the entire period of the command dispute a working relationship with MacArthur that was functional, if personally distant. He did not lobby senators. He did not give speeches about naval tradition. He did not threaten resignation or use the access his operational record gave him to pursue the question through political channels. He worked through the institution that had trained him and trusted that the institution, properly served, would protect the principle he was defending. His restraint was not passivity. It was a considered philosophy about how power operates in military organizations and how an officer serves them best. MacArthur understood how institutional memory works in democracies, and he cultivated that memory with expertise. His press operation was precise. His communiques were crafted. His farewell address to Congress in April of 1951, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away," remains among the most quoted sentences any American military officer has produced. The words were borrowed from a British Army ballad, a fact that has not diminished their staying power. There are airports and theaters and military installations named for him across the country. His memoir, Reminiscences, published in 1964, became a bestseller. Nimitz served as chief of naval operations after the war and retired in 1947 to California, where he tended a garden and corresponded with historians working through the Pacific Record. He died in February of 1966 at the age of 80. There is a museum in Fredericksburg, Texas, in the building that once served as the Nimitz Hotel, run by his grandfather, a German merchant sea captain whose stories of the Pacific trade routes had given the young Chester Nimitz his first picture of what lay beyond the Texas Hill Country. The museum is excellent and comprehensive. Outside Texas, almost nobody knows it exists. The lesson the command dispute of 1944 offers is not primarily about Nimitz's virtues or MacArthur's ambitions, though both are present in the record. It is about how institutional structures survive under pressure and about the specific kind of officer those structures need in order to survive. MacArthur used the institution as a vehicle for his purposes, lobbying it, pressuring it, shaping his communications to advance his own position within it. That is not unusual. It is, in various degrees, what ambitious officers do. But it is different in kind from the relationship Nimitz maintained. He served the institution. He submitted to its requirements. He deferred to King because King was his superior, and because Nimitz understood that his own operational effectiveness was the most honest argument he could make in King's behalf. His record was his brief. He did not need to articulate it in other terms. Roosevelt, who had been Navy himself and who read men well, saw this at Honolulu. He saw two officers who each presented a genuine professional case. And beneath the professional cases, he saw two different relationships with the authority they were asking him to grant. One man was asking for authority because he believed it was owed to him by the scale of his accomplishments and the importance of the campaign he intended to run. The other man was asking for nothing except the continuation of the arrangement that allowed the Navy to function as it knew how to function. Roosevelt made his decision accordingly, and the Pacific Fleet remained where King had placed it. On September 2, 1945, in Tokyo Bay, the most powerful naval armada in history rode at anchor in the waters of a defeated empire, and the admiral who had commanded it since Christmas morning of 1941 stood on the deck of the Missouri and signed his name beneath MacArthur's on the instruments of Japan's surrender. The machinery of victory that Nimitz had assembled, the fast carriers, the submarines, the amphibious organization that had placed American forces on island after island across half the Pacific, was intact. It had done its work, and the quiet man from Fredericksburg, Texas, who had been playing horseshoes at Makalapa Hill while MacArthur was staging return for the cameras, had kept it that way. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.